Welcome to the Consummate Athlete podcast, where we explore what it means to be a well-rounded, happy, goal-crushing athlete. Every week, myself, sports journalist Molly Herford, and cycling coach and kinesiologist Peter Glassford interview experts and chat through all of your training questions. We're excited to have you along for the ride. Hello. Welcome back to the Consummate Athlete podcast, cold weather edition. Peter, how's it going?
It's chilly, I guess. I guess that's what we're talking about today is cold weather training and performance and adaptation.
Yes, and to adapt, I have bought DW a full snowsuit.
Right. So, it's been a bit of an ordeal finding a long dog suit
with short arms,
right.
But the struggle is finally over. We'll maybe post a couple pictures of that. It's actually more, it's like a skin suit, honestly. It's a very cyclocrossy vibe.
Sure.
Sort of want to put some patches on it, make it actually a cyclocross team kind of thing. So we'll see what I do with that. But in the meantime, we are super excited to bring back one of our favorite experts to have on the podcast. We have Dr. Stephen Cheung from Brock University. Stephen is not only the guy for heat and cold and how that impacts exercise, he is also a pretty legit cyclist himself, which is part of why we enjoy talking to him so much.
Yes, he's always on adventures. He was in Iceland this past year, among other spots, and we often will see him or hear about his exploits at different races, even around Ontario as well. And bike packing and everything else. So he, I guess, walks the walk or bikes the bike or however you want to say that.
Yeah. I'm not really sure how that metaphor goes. Anyway, what did you two chat about this time?
That's right. So we had promised that after he did the heat episode, which was very well received, we talked about heat adaptation, all these trendy things around sitting in hot tubs and saunas and sweatsuits and these types of things, that he would come back and tell us in the fall and winter sort of about training and racing, performing in the cold weather. So this could be cross-country skiing, fat biking, cyclocross. There's lots of situations where the weather could be cold, and sort of talk about similar things that we might think about with heat, and then also thinking, can we adapt towards this? So it's sort of that training in, performing in, and then adapting for are sort of the three headings that we cover in this episode.
Nice. I'm super excited about it, since I feel like it's funny, I've had a conversation with a few friends where they're just like, this year, they're just really struggling to get used to the cold. So I'm hoping maybe we have a couple nuggets of wisdom in there for them, even if it is just, you got to deal with it.
It is. And so we talk about a few different things. You know, a lot of it is, I don't know if you say mental, but perceptual, where you do get used to it after a few days. And we speak towards, in the fall, it's often very hard to get used to it. We're all bundled up wearing, I've said to you many times, I don't know how I'm going to survive because I'm wearing all my coats and it's not even barely below freezing yet. And then certainly it's going to get colder here in Canada. And then in the spring, the opposite happens. We've now all gotten used to it. Maybe we've adapted in some way, but maybe getting used to it is a big chunk of it, and then suddenly we're wearing shorts at the same or lower, colder temperatures. So there's sort of that piece to it, and then there's certainly some tactics we can use around warming up, the clothes we wear, how we prepare, ahead of the competition or the training to try and minimize things like being too cold, the effects on the muscle, and then we talk around also the stuff where people get exercise-induced asthma that may be aggravated by breathing cold air. So we speak towards that as well. And how much of that is truth versus myth versus everyone wanting puffers for their performance.
That's right. We went there. All right. Without further ado, enjoy this chat with Stephen Cheung.
All right. We are back with Dr. Stephen Cheung. This is number 3 on the appearances. Congratulations on this huge achievement, Dr. Stephen Cheung.
I'm achieving the Triple Crown. Not
right.
quite as prestigious as Pogacar, but I'll take it for what it is.
And you were saying, one of the hats you wear is that you are also known as Dr. Freeze, which is topical for today's podcast on cold training and performing. So, I don't know if I should welcome Dr. Freeze separately, but that is a name you go by. Is there a story behind that?
It's Brock, when I first came, wanted to really market kind of some of the unique work that I do, and they came out with Dr. Freeze. I like to think of myself as an arch villain sometimes, certainly to some of my subjects or participants in my research, and sometimes to my students too. They kind of see me as this villain whenever I hack apart their writing.
No, it's interesting. You've done a lot of the research around dehydration and heat. I think of you more on that. Would you say that you've done a lot more on cold? Like, am I misrepresenting your body of research?
Probably about close to 50-50, I would
Okay.
say. It's
Okay.
yeah, no, like I find a fascination with cold, even though I'm not necessarily the most tolerant to cold itself.
You
I
may
kind
have gone on our national radio broadcast and said that you weren't big on it. You don't like it.
Yeah, it's well, it's like many people get into psychology or getting into clinical psychology. Uh, it's really because they can work out their own issues, right? So
Right.
I
Right.
look at it the same way. It's like, why don't
Okay.
I like cold that much? Well, I'm just going to study it.
Okay. So today we're going to go through talking about the cold and we did a heat episode that a lot of folks really liked. We talked about some how a masters athlete might do that. So everyone should go back. We'll link to it in the show notes, of course, talking about heat and heat adaptation. We did that in the summer and then we had promised that we'd do this one for the cold and sort of the winter. So we are back as promised. So what I thought we'd start with is just sort of, when I go out, I don't like to train indoors in November. I have this challenge I set for myself, no inside till December. And so it got a little cold here towards the end. So what happens to my performance when I go out? It was nice. It was, temperate for the first part of November. And then what happened here in this last week when it started getting, close to zero and even freezing as I went out and tried to do the same training?
Well, I guess first off, it's you're not going to be able to work as hard or perform as well in the cold as you can in a kind of that sweet spot between being too hot and too cold. Now, in the heat episodes, we've talked about how heat can be impairing your exercise and how you can be experiencing heat stress even in relatively what we think of as pretty comfortable temperatures, and that the ideal temperature may be cooler than we think. But then you also have too much of a kind of a good thing, so to speak. If you are too cold, you're also not going to be able to perform well. And so there's a few reasons for it. One is, simply that you're probably wearing more clothes, and there's going to be, besides the added weight, there's going to be friction from the different clothing layers. And we know that from other studies that it's not just the weight itself, is all the friction between
Mm.
layers. And you probably felt that too. You feel like the Michelin man, and you just, when you have too many layers of clothing on, and you just don't feel like you can move as freely or exercise as hard. So that's one thing. But then otherwise, why can't you kind of ride as hard or exert the same power output and go as fast? Well, the other thing is that your bike is probably weighted down. You might have fenders, you might have lights, so it's less aerodynamic. You're also wearing more clothing, you're less aerodynamic as a result. So there's that. And also in November, the leaves have mostly come down, so there's also the same wind out there, so there's less wind cover and wind break. So again, aerodynamic drag on you. And yeah, so for all of those reasons, just, not apart from even you physically
Yeah,
being
interesting.
weaker or stronger in the cold, there's all these situational factors that essentially add aerodynamic drag and are going to slow you down regardless. So your power output, you may be still able to do the same power output, but certainly your speed isn't going to be as high.
Okay. So then even wattage though we'd expect to be a little lower because of the like friction and so forth, right? Like we know the wind and the whatever, but you're saying that even we would expect a little bit of performance decrement just strictly from some of these other factors.
Well, again, I'm just talking about these situational factors that are, you can put out the same watts, but your speed is going to be lower.
Mm.
Now, your question is, well, can I put out the same watts when
Mm-hmm.
I'm cold?
Mm-hmm.
And that, I guess, is some of the research actually that we just really recently published this past year in early 2024 with my PhD student, Phil Wallace. And we were trying to look at whether there is there is an impairment with cold. And so one of the things we had was a condition where we just had your skin temperature cold, but your core was not cold. Right. And then we had two conditions where you actually, not only was your skin cold, but we also dropped your core temperature. We dropped it to half a degree or a one full degree of cooling from your normal resting body temperature. And after each of those conditions, we had you ride at a very hard intensity for as long as you can. And what we found was, compared to riding in a kind of a neutral environment, when just your skin temperature was cold, your capacity for exercise was already reduced by about 30%.
Hmm.
And then when your core was actually cooled down, your performance dropped another 30%. So, one of the big things this highlights is the importance of just wearing enough clothing to keep your muscles warm and your skin is warm, because again, that's probably why that skin cooling condition was reduced in your exercise capacity, because your your skin is cold and your muscle is a little bit cold, and that was enough to really impair your performance, let
Hmm.
alone you actually being hypothermic. So the big picture message from that is dress warmly. So if you are a cyclocross racer in the and keep your warm up clothing on for as long as you can until
Hmm.
you are right about the start. So warm up, keep yourself warm, and you see that all the time when you see the Euros cyclocross. Right there at the very last minute, that's
Yeah.
when they're ripping off their tights and
Throwing up.
jackets and
Yeah.
handing it over. So there is a reason for that. They're trying to keep themselves as warm as possible until the gun goes off.
Okay. Yeah. And then they're trying to find that sweet spot almost of like being warm enough, but then also not having some of the like extra clothing bulk that you're talking about, right? That's, they're not gonna
Hmm.
they don't no one wants to wear leg warmers if they can avoid it. I was told, we always tell the story, Jeremy Powers told me you can't win wearing leg warmers. So I was like, okay, yeah,
Yeah,
okay.
I wish that.
I'm gonna continue wearing them though, because I don't want to be cold. So is there anything else that happens then when it gets cold that might limit us? We've talked about some of the dressing and this sort of stuff, the skin temperature, the core temperature might drop if we get too cold. Is there anything else that like, might keep us from performing our best?
Yeah, the other important thing is not just that your skin stays warm, but also that your muscles stay warm. Another study that we did in our lab was really looking at muscle function in the cold. And what we did was we cooled muscle down, and then we looked at how many muscle fibers were actually being used to perform a task. So we had them perform the same amount of force. So you can look at it as riding at the same wattage, so to speak, but on a individual muscle level. So we asked them to exert a set force, and then we had them do it when their muscles were warm and also when their muscles were cold. What we found when they were having cold muscles was that to make the same kind of force, they needed more muscle fibers to be firing, and for those muscle fibers to be firing longer. So you're basically needing more muscles to fire and contract for longer to exert the same force.
Mm,
So that's one of the other reasons why you just simply need more energy. You can fatigue faster when you are cold. You are just requiring more muscles to be firing for longer.
mm, mhm,
So you look at that as if you extrapolate that to the whole body, you are again using more muscles to push at the same wattage. And as a result, the demand on those muscles, the metabolic demands is also going to be higher, all of those things. So that's another reason why that's probably one of the main reasons why you fatigue earlier. Your muscles just have to do more work to do the
mm.
same actual amount of work.
That makes sense. Yeah. Yeah. And so really what we're looking at is like one of these inverted U curves where it's like, it's too cold and then you get into that optimal zone. And then at some point it gets too hot and then your performance starts dropping again.
Yeah, yeah, your body really wants to be like Goldilocks and just be in that really kind of comfortable, moderate range. You don't want to be too cold. You also don't want to be too hot.
Okay. Now it strikes me, I've seen some video of you doing different studies over the years. Like, there must be ethical concerns when you study the cold.
Yeah, and that's one of the big issues. One of the big things I really teach my students. Actually, I have a specific lab meeting about it every year. It's about the ethics of research, but especially ethics of research in our field of environmental physiology, because unfortunately, it's a very easy direct line from some of my hypothermia research to what the Nazis did during the Second World War, and where they had in air big air quotes in the name of science of trying to understand hypothermia, they took prisoners of war and also concentration camp victims and essentially threw them into cold water until they died. And they also looked at different ways of rewarming from severe hypothermia. So, hugely unethical, obviously, but unfortunately, it's a very kind of quick jump towards some of the research that I do. So, I'm very, very meticulous about not just my
Yeah.
own ethical research, but also in teaching my students about that. And that's also one of the reasons why I'm actually the chair of human research ethics at Brock, is because I believe in that ethical research so much. One of the things that in terms of kind of internationally, the general consensus for ethical research is that we can take individuals down to a core temperature of around 35.0 degree core temperature. So
Mm-hmm.
about 2 degrees Celsius lower than our resting temperature. And
Mm-hmm.
so that's one of the big kind of principles of
Okay.
in terms of how low can we go. And that is a challenge to research into severe hypothermia because, if you are taken into ER for hypothermia, usually your core temperature is well below 35 degrees,
Mm.
right? And indeed, the clinical upper limit for mild hypothermia by medical definition is 35.0.
Oh,
So
interesting. Yeah, so it's hard
technically,
to even look at it then.
yeah. Yeah. So where do we find data on individuals that are, actually hypothermic? It is with individual case studies. Let's say you're a shipwreck survivor or you've been a hiker. There was that hiker out in BC that survived in the woods for 50 days in northern BC that just was released from hospital. Well, we have individual case studies like that, but it's very hard to draw general overall conclusions about human physiology that way. So
Hmm.
we are very limited. Again, I'm not saying we should be allowed to go lower than that, but that is an ethical consideration of how low can we take humans in the lab safely.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah. So I thought that was just important to put out there too, that it's sort of like an interesting side of your research too, that it's like very challenging to do the study. But I think for the sake of sport performance and sport, we don't really need to go that cold ever really, right? Maybe in
No,
some sort of sport diving or something like that. Maybe but they wouldn't want to get that low, I guess, right? So I think
sure.
that's,
No,
yeah.
like we talked about at the start, you don't want to be cold to perform.
Mm.
And certainly to perform optimally, you want to be in that comfortable kind of body temperature range.
And so
And
even this most
as
recent
my
one you said,
study, sorry, as my study showed, that if you drop core temperature, you are absolutely going to be heavily, heavily impaired in terms of your
yeah,
exercise
but
capacity.
not even much, like you said. So 35. So that was like a 2 degree drop. Am I right there
That's a
about?
2 degree drop, but you're
But
even
you're,
in that
yeah,
initial study, we only dropped them half a degree core temperature.
yes,
We found
right.
significant
Yeah,
impairment.
yeah.
So the
Wow.
moral of the story is certainly you don't ever want to be cold and trying to exercise to your optimum capacity. That just is not a path to any kind of an ergogenic benefit there.
Okay. Well, maybe let's use that then. So we're going to train. We're going to talk about training, and then we're going to talk a bit about adapting and performing in the cold. So when I'm going out and training now in December, and if we just got a big dump of snow, so what are like some primary things that are going to help me get a good training session through like this preparation or this gear organization? I know the one that I'll cue you to start is the face. I was just amazed because that's something I've always felt really strongly about, is covering your face to try and stay warm. But yeah, I guess there's some science behind this. So do you want to just lead me in with that one? Like when we're going training, why is that covering the face, keeping the face warm important?
Sure. Well, the first question is, do your lungs actually get damaged from breathing cold air? And the general science that is out there suggests that no, you don't actually get damaged. Your lungs, are being protected by the rest of your respiratory system. So your nose, your throat, your windpipe, and before it gets down into that very fragile alveoli, those lung sacs or air sacs within your lungs. So the air sacs you absolutely do want to protect. They are almost like a single cell, kind of very, very thin, and they can be very, very fragile. So the studies that have looked at breathing in very cold air have had participants breathe minus 35 degree air, and measured actual kind of temperature at different parts of their windpipe, kind of almost right into the lung tissue. And they showed that even with general breathing, your airways is pretty good at warming and humidifying that air by the time that it gets into your lungs. So you're probably not really going to face a lot of damage from breathing very cold air. So that's kind of the first good thing to know. And you probably see that anyways. You see cross country skiers competing in extreme cold, and they're obviously exercising extremely hard, and they're able to do that. Having said that, though, there is some kind of a few epidemiological studies out there looking at these elite Nordic skiers, people who've grown up with breathing a lot of very cold air, with some suggestion that later in life they have a little bit more risk for respiratory issues than the general population. So, acutely, probably it doesn't hurt. Long term, if you're at that elite level and always out, always breathing cold air at high ventilations, maybe there's a long term increased risk to your health, but it's not necessarily, I don't think that you're going to have major issues to it. And my belief is always exercise is so much better than its risk, than
Right.
the alternative.
And it's unlikely any of us are breathing as much as an elite, Norwegian cross-country skier or something, as far as volumes and frequency and whatever,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah, like anytime I do these interviews, I always say it's so much better to exercise than the alternative. There's just so many benefits, and even when we're talking about air pollution and stuff like that, for unless there's really, really severe smog days or wildfire days, it's
Sure.
still probably better to exercise kind of for your long-term benefit.
Sure. Okay. Now, so that's that. So then, are you saying that something like we could try and warm the air more with like the neck gaiter or something like that?
Yeah. Another really interesting study was done by polar explorer Mike Stroud in the 90s, and Mike did a lot of these self expeditions of crossing the Antarctic, pulling sleds and stuff, and really extreme adventure. And one of his questions in the paper he published was asking the question, does just my face being cold cause more energy requirements to my body? And that was his working theory, because and it turned out, according to the study he published in 1991, that yes, just your face being cold seems to increase your metabolic demands, and it seemed to do that because just the cold on your face causes an increased sympathetic nervous system response, your classic fight or flight response. So it just increases metabolic demands. So that is probably a good reason to wear a neck gaiter, and just to slow the rate of skin cooling around your cheeks, around your mouth, and also to help you to warm and humidify the air as you are breathing in.
Yeah, just even get a break. Now, I'm wondering, has anyone turned it the other way and been like, what if we want to increase energy demands and leave our face naked, so to speak, not cover our face? so that I can burn more calories, make this harder for myself. Has anyone gone that way on it?
Probably, but it's probably not the way to really
Yeah,
promote weight gain or weight loss
it's
to
not that so
just
not large. Yeah,
breathe cold air.
but if I
Um,
just put my head outside the window for a long time and just let it cool down, does that work? Then I
yeah,
don't have to go out and train.
next time you're driving, just like
That's the dogs. We're onto something.
and just stick your head out the window.
Okay. All right. Now, when we're out training again, is there? So we are thinking, okay, we want to go ahead and do a good job on our intervals. You're not, I'm joking about VO2 max, but what's going to happen is I'm going to push less power. My training might not be as good as it might otherwise have been in temperate conditions, as far as like wattage performance. So keep your face warm. You're going to stay warm. Protect your extremities. The feet, the hands. We all know this. Is there anything else then you're thinking as far as just making a training session enjoyable, safe? Probably more effective.
Yeah, well, I guess first question is kind of what kind of training session should I be doing outdoors
Oh,
versus should I be emphasizing indoors?
mm,
And I would advocate kind of the more endurance type, long, slow distance or type zone two type of workouts outdoors and leave
interesting. Yeah.
intervals more for indoors. And the reason for that is a few. One is just safety. If you're faster, the risk of accidents may be higher, especially if you don't know the road conditions or, you
Yeah.
don't know if there's going to be ice coming up or anything like that. So that's one reason, just for pure safety. And then the other reason is more that if you are doing these kind of on and off intervals where you're exercising really intensely, going slowly, exercising really intensely again, going slowly, then you're going to be building up a lot of heat and sweat during the on sessions, the on part of your intervals. And then if you're going slower, then you have all that sweat against your body and that's going to cool you down. So that's why it's probably better just to maintain that steady, moderate effort and, for outdoors. Whereas indoors, again, because of safety and because of much more controlled environment, warmer environment, you can probably get a much better bang for your buck in terms of intervals. And then that way you don't have to spend kind of 3 hours on a trainer. Instead you can be done in
Sure.
an hour and you can be doing kind of more fun things, whether it's snowshoeing, hiking, fat biking, or whatever. Just enjoy the weather, dress appropriately for it, and don't worry about, oh, what's the best workout to do. The kind of the intervals, save them for indoors.
Okay. I think that's good advice. I think something we I think echo. Um, when we're going to these training sessions, we're going outdoors. What do you think we should be thinking as far as, are we thinking about adapting to the cold, I guess? Like I'm thinking we're moving from training to performing. What do you think, we talked about the heat. We did a lot about me going into bathtubs and, no one has to remember this, but that's what we were talking about on that last podcast. So, the way I might think about this is I should get into a cold tub to get ready for like my fat bike race in February that I'm training for, right? So should I start doing cold plunges to get like, is that, there's some logic, I think, in the way I'm presenting this. So what do you think? Is there a way to adapt to the cold, I guess is what I'm going to ask you, like or to prepare, specifically for the cold?
Sure. Maybe first for the cold plunges, we can be doing a whole separate podcast for it. So I can have now my
I'll link to your CBC special about this, but yeah, just like go ahead. Yeah.
But well, first off, just like you, we're kind of experiencing the first week of really cold weather. It's been -5 to -10, kind of in the mornings here, and it feels miserable. Right? Objectively, I just am really really cold when I go walk my dog in the morning. And why is it that a week from now, when it's still -5, I'm not nearly as uncomfortable? It's not because any of my physiology have changed. My skin's temperature sensors are still sending the same signals to my brain, but my brain is essentially turned down the volume of those sensors. So it's really, we have what's called habituated to the cold. So it's all perceptual. It's not really anything physiological. We
Interesting.
have just mentally kind of turned down the uncomfortable signals from our cold
Sure.
sensors.
Which
So
is like that. They always joke about like in this time of year where we have to dress up and wear 7 coats when you go and ride. But then in the spring, when it's going to be the same temperature coming out of the winter, we're all going to wear shorts.
yep, absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's even quicker than that. Again, literally probably within a week, you end up kind of dressing less to be out in the same temperature. And again, nothing physiological has changed in you. It is all perceptual. Your brain again turning down the discomfort. So
Okay.
that's definitely one very noticeable concept and very true concept of cold adaptation is this initial habituation. Now, do we adapt to being cold? Physiologically, not nearly to the same extent as we can adapt with heat. There are major things that happen with heat adaptation that we've talked about, with plasma volume increases, with our heart rate dropping, our core temperature dropping. The reverse of that doesn't happen with the cold. So it's not as if your core temperature rises. It's not as if your heart rate changes in any way. And even in terms of metabolism, do you really change your metabolism in the cold? Not really. Certainly, some of the really nice studies done by my Canadian friend who's in Finland, Dominique Gagnon, have showed that uh, it's not as if our muscles require more glycogen to do the same work in the cold. That's not the case. So it's not like you need to kind of prioritize carbohydrates necessarily, or more carbohydrates in the cold when
Hmm.
you are training and exercising. You just need to make sure you maintain caloric intake. Um,
Yeah, yeah.
and
And have you seen anything with like thermic effect of food? Like if I eat more, this is my theory that if I eat more solids, like I have a bar or a sandwich while I'm out training on my fat bike, that I stay warmer. Does that make sense? Is there anything to that?
uh, a very little bit. I mean, there
Yeah, because
is
thermatic effect of food isn't that much, and I
no,
don't even know if it's noticeable. But yeah,
yeah,
no.
it's pretty minor.
I think
It's
I've
real.
heard that from like a Arctic explorer, but again, it could just be I don't know.
Yeah, they're also eating a lot of calories, and the other things, they're eating a lot of fat in a sense out of
That's what they were
necessity
saying. Yeah,
because, and
light,
it's not, again, it's not necessarily really because of metabolic shift. It's just fat is a much easier to pack in terms
denser.
of
Yeah,
calorie dense,
yeah, yeah.
right? So, and
Okay,
often it's in a very kind of much more stable kind of package than the equivalent carbohydrates. So,
okay,
yeah, in terms of fuel, you don't necessarily need to worry about, oh, do I need to emphasize this carbohydrate versus fat kind of during my rides? I would
okay.
just fuel the same. I would just make sure you get sufficient calories. And talking about probably the craziest study I've done, we really found that out because in 2010 we did a study where it was funded by Coast Guard and Search and Rescue, and we want to look at the metabolic demands of long-term shivering. So you can imagine if you're out in a survival situation, you need to generate heat, and it's done through shivering. And we do know that when you do start to shiver, shivering requires relatively more carbohydrates to fuel it than fats, right? So there is the risk that if you run out of carbohydrates, you may end up not being able to shiver anymore, and then therefore your
Oh,
survival odds will go down. So we wanted to test that because in the Arctic, if you had a mass rescue, you can be up to 5 to 7 days, even in ideal circumstances, before a mass rescue can happen. But we were talking about hypothermia studies, and most hypothermia studies, because of the ethical limit, because of the discomfort, last only about 2 hours. So that's a really long study. It's a
yeah.
long time to be uncomfortable. So you're taking data from 2-hour experiments and trying to extrapolate to 5 to 7 days. Really
Mm.
challenging, right? And so we tried to push the envelope and we went for 24 hours. And we were specifically trying to answer the question, do you are you able to continue shivering throughout 24 hours? And so we were feeding them lifeboat survival rations, which are just horrible. They're high fat and they're very, very horrible to eat. And so they were eating that. And what we found was that the the shivering was actually able to be sustained over 24 hours, but the way it was being fueled shifted. Initially, there was a very high reliance on carbohydrates, but then after about 8 to 12 hours, the body seems to shift towards more reliance on fat to fuel the shivering. So one of the big conclusions I draw from that study is the important thing is just to keep the body fed in the cold. Don't really worry about what macronutrient is
Mm.
to make up. Just make sure there's sufficient calories. And that's the same advice now that I give to military planners when they're planning missions and stuff.
Mm.
So, which again goes back to for an athlete, I wouldn't worry about, oh, I need to have this kind of fat or this kind of carbohydrates. Just make sure you're eating enough during exercise and you can exercise for a long time.
Okay. So then in terms of preparing then, you talked about this habituation. So, probably you're saying that it doesn't make sense to do even cold showers or cold plunges to try and accelerate that. It's already happening pretty fast just by training in the cold.
Yep.
I guess say I'm in California and I know I'm coming back to race in my fat bike race. This could happen. Do I should I try like some cold showers to try and like habituate myself to the cold or something like with that? Is there any sense to that?
Yeah, that would be really a useful thing for people who are used to being in warm weather, and because you want to ultimately train to match your event, right? So if you know it's going to be in the cold, but you are living in a hot environment, then absolutely take some cold showers, do that for a few days to get used to it, and that way when you do come back to a cold climate and compete, it won't be nearly as uncomfortable. So that is a good use for that. But for the rest of us who are already in a cold climate, probably not. We're probably going to get enough kind of cold stimulus to really have that habituation anyways and do it
Yeah.
naturally.
Now, almost pulling it the other way. So, say I've been continuing my heat adaptation and my maintenance of that. I have these adaptations now that you've helped me form. Am I shooting myself in the foot when I prepare for my fat bike race? Or do you think that assuming I can dress well and warm up well and just work really hard during the event, that I should actually be at the same or better level of performance because of my heat adaptation?
Yeah, I guess there's a big gap in literature between, for example, a lot of the heat training has been done on cyclists, and obviously cyclists mostly compete in the summertime, certainly at the professional level. Um, Not much study actually has been done on, for example, Nordic skiers, right, who are also obviously highly endurance based, aerobic based, and compete in the winter. And should they combine heat training, and how do they do that, in a
Mm-hmm.
winter environment? So, not much objective research. My best guess would be that yes, you can kind of get heat adapted before winter really sets in, and then you can still get that once a week or maybe at most twice a week kind of heat stimulus. You can probably maintain it into winter fairly well for a pretty decent amount of time, and then doing things like the cold showers or cold plunges for that habituation effect isn't going to ruin your overall heat adaptation. So I think they can be combined, and if it's done kind of smartly and planned well, I don't think they're going to negate each other. But at the same time, not much research kind of has been done on, again, Nordic skiers, for example, using them as test subjects.
Hmm. And perhaps we'll see that in the coming years with just all the interest around heat. And then now they're trying to say like, oh, heat might help with blood factors and,
Yep.
hematocrit or whatever. Yeah. Yeah. So maybe
Yeah.
that'll come. Do you think?
I'm sure, especially with a lot of the Norwegians being kind of world leaders in endurance sports now, whether in triathlon or elsewhere, that yeah, they're probably going to be already thinking ahead to, okay, how can we train our speed skaters, our Nordic skiers, and have them kind of have the best of all worlds.
Hmm. Okay. All right, so that's sort of like adapting, getting ready for it. Specificity sounds like sort of the key takeaway there. Now we get to my fat bike race in February. Is there anything, when I have a hot race in July, mountain bike race, we're doing cold towels, we're doing cooling, pre-cooling. We've done the heat adaptation before, and then we're trying to stay really cool on the line and in the warm up. Is there a reverse strategy that I should use at the fat bike race? It's very cold. What should I do to prepare to not be too cold during my event then?
Yeah, well, we talked about the importance of keeping yourself as warm as possible, or certainly not to have your skin cold, and absolutely not having core temperature cooling before the gun goes off. So that's really, really critical. So you want to have a good warm up. You want to get to the line, keep your warm clothes on, and then take them off at the last second or last minute. And so that would be the first thing. And then you're going to be generating so much heat really with the high resistance of a fat bike on snow and stuff that you're probably not going to become hypothermic or really experience severe cold during the race itself. So it's not like you're going to get too cold. In essence, you might get too hot really because of how much work you're doing for relatively low speed. And so the big thing probably is more protect your hands and feet or whatever makes you uncomfortable. For me, it's definitely my hands. If my hands get cold, besides the fact that you can't shift or brake nearly as well, you're just so incredibly uncomfortable that, that becomes your primary focus, not necessarily going hard. So, use whatever you need to. For my winter cycling, I have a set of bar mitts on my bike, those big neoprene covers that
Yeah.
really help keep my hands warm. If you need electric heaters in your socks or shoes, do so. I find that's probably the biggest limiter to exercise in the cold, rather than my actually getting too cold in terms of my
Mm-hmm.
overall body temperature.
Mm-hmm. I saw mention. I don't know if it was in one of the studies you sent, or maybe one of the articles was putting a bag sort of over your sock, but inside your shoe. Is that something you do?
That would certainly help because it
Okay.
would kind of keep the warm air coming off of your feet into like in the bag, so to speak, and it would also help with a little bit of wind protection. So
Yeah.
another thing other people do is put tinfoil kind of
On the
uh,
top, maybe.
yeah,
Yeah, I just worry that I would get like really soggy feet or something. But I get
yeah,
like I can see it. I like the concept, but I was like, I don't know if I've seen like you're talking about either the hot packs or the tinfoil or the duct tape or something like that.
yeah.
But I was like, oh, maybe
Certainly,
I should try that. But
yeah, certainly simple modifications you can do is I have a really poorly ventilated kind of road helmet that I use for my winter riding.
yeah,
So in that case, ventilation is not your friend. You
sure. Yeah, that's what my aero helmet's for. It's not really for aerodynamics. It's just for
Yeah,
that. Yeah, yeah,
and if it's really bad, then I switch to my snowboard helmet, right? Then there's even
sure.
less ventilation in that. Um, yeah, so you absolutely want to reduce kind of heat loss. And I guess another question we should probably talk about is the old adage of do you lose most of the heat from your head? And is that why you should wear a hat? And it's not necessarily because you lose more of your heat from your head than from any other part. Is because most of the time we're wearing a jacket, we're wearing pants, long johns, we're wearing boots and gloves.
Oh,
But
of course.
if we're not
Yeah.
covering your
Okay.
head.
So this is like your
There's
grandma's telling you to put your hat back on and you lose all your hair through your head. It's like, no, I'm just wearing all my clothes. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. It's just make sure your head has clothes on it too, right? It's a good analogy is if you lose most of your a good counter argument is if you're saying I lose most of my heat through my head, then in that case, I should be able to wear a really warm toque and just go out in shorts. That's not the case. It's
Right.
you're still going to get cold elsewhere, right?
Yeah.
So you just want to cover your head, not necessarily because it's going to lose more heat, just because it's like the rest of your body, you're still going to lose heat from it.
Sure. Okay. And I guess, I think correctly guessed that my fat bike race would be pretty intense, like a shorter one, probably under 2 hours. But a lot of people are doing these fat bike. I saw 140 miles or something in Michigan. And this is so I think in those cases, you'd be bundling up more and more because your heat generation is less and less. Right. And sort of I don't know if there's any other things you would
Yeah.
add for, obviously exposure becomes an issue in that sense, but I think it's similar to what you were saying. But I don't know, is there anything you would change if it wasn't like a very high intensity type race?
You're absolutely right. I mean, the amount of heat that you generate plays a big role in how cold or not cold you're going to get over the course of an event. So if you are, again, riding a fat bike race at 140 kilometers, you're definitely not going to be riding it at the same pace as,
Hmm.
let's say, a
Yeah.
20K
Yeah.
one, right? So you're going to be going a lot slower. You're going to be generating less heat. And yes, in that case, you're still going to be losing a lot of heat. And yeah, you can end up losing body heat and eventually getting cold that way. So you're absolutely right. If you are knowing you're going to be going for slower and longer, then you probably do want to bundle up more. And which again gets to the whole concept of layering, right? The whole concept of layering is that hey, you can unzip and you still have another layer underneath if you are kind of you know going very hard, and then when you are going slower, then you zip back up or put that extra layer on. So that's really really important. You want to be dressed for the occasion, but in general you can gain a surprising amount of heat from exercise, so don't underestimate that. And yeah. One other thing we should talk about is the fact that we talked about breathing earlier, and that most of us were not going to run into problems with it. But there is a specific group, individuals who have asthma, may be affected by breathing very cold, dry air because it's an irritant, and that can set off asthma. Same with some people, even without asthma, may have exercise induced bronchospasms. And so those individuals, again, because breathing cold, dry air can be very irritating, can set off those symptoms of respiratory issues. So how would you get around that? Well, there's a couple of things you can do. We already talked about wearing a neck gaiter or a mask to kind of help warm and humidify the air. Another thing you can do is warm up indoors before you go out, right? So
Right.
so that way you're already used to breathing a good amount of air, your kind of lungs and your respiratory system is warmed up, and then you go outside and start exercising. It's not going to be nearly as much of a shock. So that's one, or those are two simple things that people who do experience respiratory issues in the cold can do to minimize that.
Okay, and it's interesting. My last thing for you was actually around respiratory stuff, but I will say before I forget that we will link to some. You have a PEZ toolbox. You have lots of great PEZ articles, but we'll link to one about the cold. And then there's also a great, and I think it's free on Fast Talks, or at least partially free on Fast Talk around cold weather physiology. So I'll link to that. It's worth paying for if you do have to pay for it, but it seems like I could watch some videos for free. So that I'll link to, and then a few of the studies we've mentioned. My question around respiration was with, I don't know your views on respiratory training generally, but some of this stuff where they say, you'll breathe deeper and less often. sometimes they talk about that helping asthma. Have you seen anything like that where it helps with some of these exercise in the cold, or someone who has asthma or respiratory stuff brought on by the cold?
I'm not really familiar with kind of respiratory training and asthma. My guess would be that respiratory training for those individuals can help reduce the kind of the risk of these asthma attacks more because you're just more aware of your breathing, right?
It's
And
hard
you're,
to untangle all this. Yeah.
yeah,
Even without any of this cold stuff, right? It's hard to untangle the psychological, but I would agree. Yeah. There's how much of this perceived exertion and familiarity is there?
yeah,
Yeah.
because breathing is such a primal thing in our life, right? If we don't breathe, we're dead. And so just the fact that there is kind of respiratory limitations, if you breathe in and you feel kind of that shock or that discomfort, well, that sends a signal to your brain, I'm in distress, maybe don't go as hard, right? So
Mm.
that whole physiological feedback, there's a lot of things from the amount of carbohydrates in our body to the temperature, but also breathing or respiratory distress. It's very uncomfortable to not be able to breathe well. And again, that sends a signal to our brain. We're in potential danger. You might want to slow down.
Okay, and then the last one, actually, there's one more here. I had just mentioned the psychological stuff, and I don't, I imagine sometimes you get really frustrated as a physiological type guy, where it's like, you wish you could almost take that stuff out of it, but you can't, and it gets messy. But I imagine there must just be a huge, if I say I'm good in the cold, or if I say I hate the cold, you and me are more on the I hate the cold. But does that make us worse at the cold because we now have identified ourselves as people who aren't good in the cold?
Yeah, I think that's a huge role to it. We know that kind of our willingness to exercise is partly driven by our motivation and kind of how we identify ourselves, right? Just like I'm a climber or I'm a sprinter. I hate
Yeah.
hills. I love hills, right?
Hmm.
Just you're saying that if you identify as, oh, I hate hills, I'm not a climber, then every
Yeah.
time you go climb a hill, that's already in your head. So I don't love the cold, but I would say we all as athletes should embrace all environments and not limit ourselves. Just like, your podcast is literally a consummate athlete, right?
Yeah.
Should be
Yeah.
embracing all sorts of adventures, all sorts of exercise in all sorts of environments. So I think we can adapt and perform well in all environments. Maybe not to our absolute ceiling of perfection, but I think we can perform well in the cold. We can perform well in the heat. We just have to understand how it limits us and how to minimize those limitations and and still get out and exercise. I would
Yeah.
never ever advocate not exercising, because of, it's too cold, it's too hot. It's you can always find ways around it, and exercise is always better than the alternative.
Love it. Love it. Dr. Stephen Cheung, a third fantastic episode. I'm thankful. I'm not as into this one as the heat one, but we got it done. We got it done. And I'll tell you, I'm going to go right into a fat bike ride right now in the cold. So I will use some of these techniques to stay warm and enhance my performance. You'll have to remind me, is it Thermal Doc? Is that your
Yep.
Instagram and Twitter, your X?
Yes, in my Instagram is thermal doc with a period between thermal and doc,
We'll
and
link to it.
on X or Twitter it's at EEL Brock, and
Right.
EEL is my lab, environmental ergonomics lab at Brock.
Right. Right. Perfect. I love it. Thank you so much. We'll see you again soon.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks so much for tuning in to the Consummate Athlete podcast. If you want to hear more training, racing, and endurance sport advice, make sure you subscribe to the podcast and leave us a rating and review. You can also subscribe to our newsletter at consummateathlete.com for a weekly dose of inspiration and advice straight to your inbox.